Well, thank you very much, Eileen. And I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and repeat, as others have done, that of course they have never ceded their country, and we must do everything in solidarity for them to develop their struggles to more victories. They thoroughly know how to do those things. We need to be better at expressing our solidarity and acting on it with them. Just looking at the ages of all the panelists, it's fair to say probably that I'm the one who goes back the most, I suspect, to including the mid to late 70s, where struggles were developed around the relationship between the industrial wage, or wages as we know it, and then the social wage, as it was then called. And that was very much because of some very similar stories back then to what we are hearing tonight about what's been happening with unemployment, but also with things like taxation, where the Fraser government had been supervising the most astounding taxation rorts that were therefore providing it with a weakened base to deal properly with what should be the unemployment benefit and other forms of the social wage. Now, I'm just going to talk very quickly because this is what Life Campaign were keen for me to talk about. I'm not going to speak to every single point, but really just all about the significance of minimum wages, the relationship between the industrial wage in the form that includes the minimum wage and the social wage. And you'll see that if you have a look at the wage, Life Campaign second demand, it says in part under item number 2 that we believe that we should see an increase in the minimum wage. And the main form in which the minimum wage takes in Australia, of course, is in the national minimum wage, which is determined every year by the annual wage review that is conducted by the Fair Work Commission, required to do so statutorily under the Fair Work Act. And the requirements imposed on the Fair Work Commission by the Fair Work Act, which the Fair Work Commission gleefully take hold of, are a perfect example of the rules, the broken rules in the Fair Work Act that we were fighting to change and still should be to this day. So in terms of what happened, I won't go through all of these points, but the Fair Work Commission is in charge of making a decision each year about whether there should be an increase in the minimum wage and whether that should be applied to the minimum rates for all classifications in all of the awards, and if so, how much and when. So last year, the ACTU, as one of the interested parties that makes submissions, the principal submission on behalf of all Australian workers, put in a claim for 4%. The employers sought an outcome at 0%. The result was a decision of 1.75%. Then, using the excuse of COVID-19, the Commission then introduced staggered starting dates for that 1.75% increase. And it said that those industries that had been least affected by COVID-19 could get theirs, as would normally be the case for everybody, in July of last year. Those that were adversely affected from the 1st of November, which is a bigger pay cut, and then those that were most affected would not get theirs until February of this year. Now, we're talking here about 2.5 million workers, just about, that are dependent upon the minimum wage. And there is not a single industry where there is not a significant part of the workforce that is dependent on the minimum wage. So what's happening this year? Well, despite the fact that profits are going up, and I should say when we're talking about bludgeoning, you've only got to look at the share of profits, that is that proportion of profits that employers invest productively in the economy is at disaster level. In other words, big profits, but very little private sector investment and heading southwards or stagnating year on year. Who are the real bludgers? Those who are making the big profits. The ACTU claim for this in this context this year is for a 3.5% increase for everyone. The employers have responded by urging that the Commission adopt, again, a cautious approach, as they call it, and have formalised that at 1.1% just last week or so. They want a repeat of the staggered increases, as was happening last year, that is staggered more wage cuts. And the federal government has chimed in using the same language, exactly the same language as the employers, calling for a cautious approach. Although they have wimped out the federal government on saying just what the increase should be. And the final submissions in this whole process will begin to occur in just a week or two after the national accounts come down. So why is this so important? Well, the process is actually very dodgy. We talked a bit about how it is a perfect example of the broken rules in the Fair Work Act. They actually build a closer connection. The process builds a closer connection between the poverty commissions experienced, particularly by unemployed people. But the Fair Work Act controls minimum wages because it is consultation and submissions only. The whole ideology of it, when you look at it, it's dominated by ruling class economics. There is a working class economics, but that is studiously ignored by just about all of the discussion around the economic arguments for and against what the increase should be. There is no bargaining. Industrial action is prohibited with penal powers attached for any union or group of unions or group of workers, whether they're in unions or not, who seek to use industrial action to try and strengthen their capacity to win an argument over what the minimum wage should be. Running an industrial campaign would require defiance of the Fair Work Act. It is feasible, in my view, to develop a mass and visible socio-industrial campaign, but we need more time to have a proper discussion about that. The outcome is a big deal for all workers and for all citizens who are dependent in some way or another on some form of government income. We go back to a basic feature of working class life. For people who are on an industrial wage, there are always family members, friends who are not. And those who are not are always supported by the family members who are on the industrial wage. So if there is downward suppression of the industrial wage, then that means that it is even harder for working class families and friends and communities to develop an improved standard of living. The overall standard of living goes down. And the psychological pressure of people who are not on the industrial wage, but are on the pension or in some dire straits associated with the situation in aged care at the moment, or who are disabled, or who are unemployed. The psychological impact of dependency on someone whose industrial wages being suppressed is totally alienating. This is what the Life campaign is all about, is stitching together a much broader, in terms of numbers of people I'm talking about here, a much broader understanding of the interactions between the exploitation of workers at work and the social exploitation that is driven by instruments like the budget upon people who are not in paid work in the industrial wage. The Life campaign is making a big deal of trying to bring together, this is the theoretical, if you like, the framework for understanding why, sure, there are all sorts of identities in the working class, but every single one of those identities have one thing in common. They are all exploited by the system of which the budget is one element. Thank you very much.